Well, welcome everybody to this month's RSA webinar. I'm Dr. Meredith Doig, President of the Rationalist Society, which is Australia's oldest free thought group. Now, before we begin, I'd like to invite you to join with us in acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their continuing connections to land and to sea and to community. Now, some of you may know that the Productivity Commission is currently undertaking a public inquiry into philanthropy with the aim of working out how to meet the federal government's goal of, I think it's doubling the philanthropic giving by 2030. And yesterday I was part of a roundtable hosted by the Productivity Commission. Sorry, I was just making sure that I was allowing extra people to join us. So as part of this roundtable organised by the Productivity Commission, and that gave me the opportunity to just reiterate some of the points that we had made in a submission, that is the Rationalist Society had made in a submission to the Productivity Commission on this, in their inquiry into philanthropy. And I just want to quickly say what the three major points of our submission to the Productivity Commission were. Firstly, and this has been a long-standing argument by the Rationalist Society, we argue that the notion of advancing religion, which has been ahead of charity for a number of years. And when I say a number of years, 400 years, since 1601, that is Elizabeth I, not Elizabeth II. So advancing religion has been assumed to be a charitable purpose for centuries, as I say, since 1601. But we argue that while it may have been relevant 400 years ago, or even maybe 200 years ago, in this day and age, the idea of saying that advancing religion, which is after all advancing belief in a supernatural being, is no longer relevant or appropriate as an automatic head of charity. So that was our first point. And it's one that we've made on many occasions before. But secondly, our argument included the idea of these entities called Basic Religious Charities. Now, Basic Religious Charities are organisations that claim that their one and only charitable purpose is advancing religion. And when they are categorized as a basic religious charity, they are exempt from the need to provide any financial reports to the Charities Commission, the ACNC. And they are also exempt from having to comply with the governance standards that all the other charities have to comply with. So we questioned whether that should be the case. And thirdly, at the roundtable yesterday, I did make reference to the excellent new volume that RSA fellow Neil Francis has now put together on religion and charities. And broadly speaking, that report shows that, yes, it is true that religionists tend to give more money and to volunteer more than non-religionists in Australia, but they tend to give more and to volunteer more to themselves, that is, to their own congregations, not necessarily to the general public. So we would suggest that such giving and such volunteering is really for the private benefit of the churches or the religious institutions rather than to the public benefit. But tonight, we have with us somebody who can give a lot more detail on the data about basic religious charities. Dr. Phil Saj is a visiting scholar with the University of Adelaide's Business School. He's an accountant with a PhD and a special interest in the accountability and the governance of not-for-profit organisations. And he's published on these topics, both in Australian and in overseas journals. And he's made presentations on these topics in professional and academic seminars. And he has personally a long involvement in third sector organisations, both as a volunteer and in governance roles. So in a minute, I'll invite Phil to present to you on some really interesting research that delves into what are basic religious charities and what are the characteristics of them. But before I invite Phil to give that presentation, I would also like to acknowledge that we have Alec Spencer with us. Now, Alec is completing a PhD looking at the privileging of religious organisations in the financial area. So, and he personally has particular insight into this because he used to be an executive officer within the Australian Christian churches. And it was he who was recently featured in a podcast series called Faith on Trial, which delved into the scandals at Hillsong Church. So after Phil has made his presentation, I might invite Alec to make a few remarks, and then we'll move into the usual Q&A. We have, as usual, had some questions that have been sent in beforehand, but you know the drill. If you do have a question, please feel free to type it in the chat box, and we will get through as many of those questions as we can. So with that introduction, Phil, may I hand over to you and invite you to share the screen and give us your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Meredith, and thank you to the Rationalist Association for inviting me. I think this is a topic of importance, and it's a topic that your organisation is doing a lot of good work on, and I'm so pleased to be able to share this tonight. So I'm just going to share the screen. Just move that there. Okay, so basic religious charities and the case for more transparency. At the moment, as Meredith has said, with basic religious charities, they're the only category of charity that is exempt from reporting any financial information under the ACNC Act. All other charities are required to report an activity statement, and depending on their size, it's a differential reporting, with larger charities reporting more financial information, but all have to report some financial information, except of course for the basic religious charities. And that was something of a surprise when the Act came in 2012. It came in after an exhaustive process of consultation. And just right at the end of that period, just as the Act was going through Parliament, this concept of the basic religious charity was born. It was inserted into the final draft of the legislation. Very little commentary on it, on the public record. And it was passed. The only information, justification for basic religious charities that's on the public record came 5 years later in their 5-year review of the ACNC Act. And I'll be addressing those arguments later in this presentation. What I wanted to do, my objectives in doing this research was really to find out about basic religious charities. As I said, it's a unique category to Australia. It just came in towards the end of the consultation process, and we have it there was little said until 2017. So let me just begin with a little bit of descriptive data. There were, I have in this table 8,086. There were another 230 basic religious charities. These are based on 2020 figures, but it wasn't possible to ascertain what those other 200 did. So of those 8,300 that were registered as basic religious charities, I was able to determine for 8,086 of them what they actually did. And certainly, as you can see, the 81% are parishes and churches. The term basic religious charity, when it was introduced, it was described that the basic religious charity would mainly be a local place of worship, which is true. However, there are 20% or 19% of basic religious charities that are doing other things. And what are those other things? Well, there are some which are religious charitable development funds, which operate really as credit unions. They take deposits and lend money to religious organizations. There are some which are other funds, and so they are doing things like their funds to support priests in retirement or long service leave of priests, or funding car pools, motor vehicle pools. There were 436 property trusts. There were 402 organizations providing non-financial support, and that ranged from management consulting services through to holiday camps for youth. There were a small number that were really trading enterprises, mainly in the publishing area, some in the funeral services industry, and some selling religious regalia. There were 37 that were providing welfare services, and then you can see there were a number that were providing coordination, administration, or governing bodies, synod officers, for example, and a number that were religious orders, closed movements, faith-based movements, some of which who did do some welfare work, the parishes and churches, and then some that I categorize as other ministries, largely web-based churches. So and you can see the size. The size is based on the 2020 ACNC threshold. So small is revenue under 250,000, medium is between 250,000 and a million, and large is revenue over 1 million. So there certainly were, while most are small, there certainly were some very large organizations. The largest, for which, I mean, the problem is, of course, and it's the purpose of this research, is that basic religious charities do not have to report to the ACNC any financial information. As Meredith said, they're also exempt from the governance requirements, but I'm not covering that topic. Some, however, do report for one reason or another, and the religious charitable development funds, they are regulated by the Australian Prudential Regulatory Authority, and there is a requirement that they provide their financial statements. So it is possible to see how big they are. Interestingly, there are 58 RCDS. Only 21 have self-classified as basic religious charities. Many are incorporated, and so that would preclude them from being a basic religious charities. But of those 21, we can see that the largest of them are very large organizations, and together in 2020 they controlled more than $6 billion worth of assets. So there were some other very large BRCs for which information was available, and one in particular in Sydney with the central business district assets of more than $200 million. So of the parishes and churches, they ranged, again, I have to say this, these figures, they can only be taken as indicative as opposed to representative, because it's only I was able to, some voluntarily reported, some reported within a diocese on the diocesan website, and so it was possible to get that information there. But so there are certainly some largish churches as well as some, and I think most of the churches are small. To me, one of the most outstanding findings was that the overwhelming majority of basic religious charities that operate within a denominational framework, and they have financial reporting requirements imposed on them through those frameworks, which are far more onerous than those required under the ACNC Act. For small charities under the ACNC Act, they need to only report 12 line items of financial information. That is, small charities that are not basic religious charities. Whereas small basic religious charities reporting within their denominational frameworks were required to report 10, 20, 30, 40 lines of information, financial information. One data item that BRCs are required to report that in their annual information statement is their human resource deployment. So we can get some idea of what basic religious charities are doing by looking at the number of paid staff and volunteer that they deploy. Now, the largest were those in the governance, administration, and coordination category. And what I think is very interesting is that those with the smallest numbers were property trusts and other funds that had, in terms of paid staff, 0.01 and 0 respectively. So of the 436 property trusts that classified as BRCs, 93% were small and 98% reported no staff or volunteers altogether, which suggests that these are really merely vehicles for holding property. So well, they're advancing religion by holding property, in which religious observance and, well, some of the property is used for commercial purposes as well. So they do, they meet I'm not suggesting that they don't meet the definition of a charity. To meet the definition of a charity under the head of religion is that you have the purpose of advancing religion. And certainly when the new Charities Act came in 2013, it was actually explicitly stated there that providing buildings for religious worship was included in the definition of advancing religion. But one would have to ask the question, why the secrecy? Why the veil of secrecy? Why no disclosure if all they're doing is holding property? The other outstanding finding for me was that the small parishes and churches reported higher numbers of paid staff and volunteers than did small charities that were not basic religious charities and which are required to report financial information. So we'll see in a moment, one of the arguments put for having this category of basic religious charities was this idea of capacity, that basic religious charities did not have the capacity to report 12 line items of financial information. But we do see that those charities that are not basic religious charities, like all other charities, must report this information, the financial information.
Phil, just before you go on to those arguments, can I just ask one question? Because you mentioned that BRCs, by definition, should be unincorporated, or if they're so unincorporated.
Well, they cannot be incorporated under the Corporations Act, the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islanders Corporations Act, the Corporations Act of Norfolk Island, or the State or Territory Associations and Corporations Acts. So those are the main acts that
Right.
any not-for-profit in Australia would be incorporated under.
So does that
Something
mean
like,
that they are exposed to liability because they're not incorporated?
Well, yes and no. The no part of that answer is that many are actually incorporated, which was another surprise for me. Dating back to the middle of the 19th century, there were enabling acts of parliament which enabled religious organizations either to buy and manage property and or to have perpetual succession. The Archbishop of Perth is an example where that position is actually incorporated under an enabling act. So some are incorporated, but not under the what one would call the everyday legislation for incorporating. And whether they're liable or not, I think that has come up many times. I don't know the answer to that. My feeling is, I'm not a lawyer, my feeling is that they would be liable, but particularly for small or for churches that belong to or operate within a denominational framework, such as the Anglican or the Catholic Church, I think there would be some, well, my understanding is that there is some backup there that those churches would provide that support if they were sued. But yes, they're not incorporated, and so I think they
maybe an opportunity.
Sorry?
Maybe an opportunity.
Yeah.
Anyway, you were going to go on to the why these BRCs came about and what was the justification for them.
Well, the justification came 5 years later. As I said, it went through, I was able to find from the second reading speeches when it went through in 2012, the Act in Hansard, maybe half a page, 3/4 of a page. It was, I think it was, anyway, it went through rather quietly. It was a difficult time. It was a minority government. I think the issue was, most, 99% of the Act got through as it was intended, and it's been a terrific thing. I think the charity sector and the Australian community have benefited greatly from the ACNC, and the price of getting it through Parliament in those heady days of the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd government was that there was a carve-out of accountability or transparency for basic religious charities. So the arguments that were put 5 years later were that most basic religious charities receive their support from members, and therefore they don't have any external accountability. So why should anybody have a right to know what they're doing? I think the rebuttal to that, of course, is that basic religious charities, like all charities, receive indirect benefits through concessional tax treatment, income tax, fringe benefits tax, goods and services tax are not paid, and they get significant reductions in the payment of council rates, other levies, land tax, and utilities connections and things like that. In their annual information statements, 7.2%, which is not a small number, actually reported that they do raise funds in their annual information statements, but a much larger percentage have a facility on their websites to receive donations. Now, some of that, I think, is probably came about through COVID. I'm looking at 2020 figures. But just looking at some of those websites, they look pretty sophisticated with big buttons, give, donate, etc. Words like that, attracting funds. So I think that argument really doesn't stand up. The second argument that basic religious charities operating within a denominational structure have a binding financial requirement of the denomination, and that is so true. And the overwhelming majority of basic religious charities do operate within a denominational framework. but the principles on which the ACNC Act are based on public rather than private relationships that I think most people in Australia think have the idea of the fair go and equal treatment. And if we're going to have an act, and I think one of the the three objectives of the ACNC Act was to promote trust and confidence in the charity sector, and promoting trust and confidence is achieved in large part through transparency of reporting. So for any other charity, anybody can go onto the ACNC website, go to the portal, type in the charity name, and see their annual information statement, their governing document, their profile, who the board members are, and the financial information. If it's a large charity, the financial information is a financial report, full financial report. If it's a small charity, it is simply 12 line items on the annual information statement. But nonetheless, and that's that's differential reporting. It's one of the main principles in Australian financial reporting. In Australian accounting, we have differential reporting. The main types of activities that BRCs will be undertaking will be holding religious services, and they have a limited administrative capacity. That was the argument put. Well, it's true that the main, certainly my study shows unequivocally that small parishes and churches are the greatest percentage of basic religious charities. However, as I mentioned, they have greater capacity as measured by full-time equivalent staff positions and volunteer numbers. They have greater capacity in terms of human resources than do those small charities that are not BRCs that must report. The requirements of the denominational structures or the denominational authorities for small parishes or for all BRCs in a denomination, but particularly the small ones, they are far in excess of what's required under the ACNC Act. And that includes having to have an audit. Most of them have to have an external audit. Small charities that are not BRCs under the ACNC Act do not have to have an audit. The fourth argument was one of cost, which is that removing the exemption for BRCs that operate under the denominational structure would lead to an increase in regulatory obligations and compliance costs without a commensurate community benefit. Well, if 17% of all charities, so approximately 1 in 6 charities are basic religious charities, I think most people would think that it would be worth the cost to have that increased transparency. If as is one of the principles that underpins the ACNC Act, that public trust and confidence is a very important thing. So they're not a small section of the charity population, they're quite a large section. There was an argument put in terms of cost as well, that valuations of real estate would be difficult because of the nature of the buildings, and also an expensive and complex exercise. Well, any accountant will tell you that the accounting standards permit any entity to choose between recognizing property at historical cost or getting it revalued. So it's a choice. It's not mandatory to do that. And in any event, one of the large, well, probably the largest diocese in the country does revalue its property every 3 years now. So I think that argument doesn't really carry much weight either. Another argument for not reporting was that the denominational frameworks require a standard form of reporting. And therefore, if a BRC had to report in a different way, under a different format to the ACNC, it would result in additional reporting. Well, that again is untrue, because I looked at 3 of the major denominations in Australia, which were the Anglican Church, the Lutheran Church, and the Uniting Church, that had their accounting manuals available on the website, and they all permit, some allow a choice between cash and accrual accounting, and some do have a preferred format, but they will allow any entity, in church or other organization in the within the denominational framework, to report in a way that suits them. So I mentioned, so those are the arguments. Those are the arguments that were put some 5 years later to justify why basic religious charities should be treated differently to other charities. And from my point of view, I think none of them hold water.
Well, can I
I've
just
mentioned that I've talked about what the different categories did. So I think I might just go over.
Can I just interrupt and ask a question, because it occurs to me that we don't really know where the notion of basic religious charities came from. What you found was a review of them in the 5-year review.
Yes.
Right. But would you care to speculate?
Oh, well, I think it's the only the arguments that were put in the 5-year review. I mean, there were a number of submissions, of course, but the ones that were really where you can see a lot of time and effort had been put in, and thought had been put in, were from the Anglican Church and the Catholic Church. So the examples that or the arguments, when I've just a moment ago said, well, here's the argument and there's a rebuttal, I went through those submissions to the 5-year review, and found, looked at the arguments that were put, and they were put by those 2 main denominations. So
there's a comment in the chat box from Andrew Gunn, and he asks, and this may be speculative on your part, but he asks, do you think that the premise for why BRCs operate as they do in the main is driven by the aim of reasserting their waning political and moral influence on an increasingly secular society? Would you care to comment?
Well, I think they're being perhaps, are they? Maybe they are mounting something of a rearguard action. They're very secretive. I mean, in the report on the Royal Commission into institutional child sex abuse was very critical of the churches, amongst a number of reasons, but one of the was their secrecy, with the fact that they weren't open in their communications, and they weren't open about what they did. And in fact, the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference, which is the leading body for the Catholic Church, it produces an annual report, and in 2020 it had a 1-line item which said we have a surplus of $11 million this year, and they went on in that report to comment on the comment that I've just made about the Royal Commission's findings about secrecy and lack of transparency, and they actually made the comment that it would be perhaps good if the larger organisations like the Catholic Bishops' Conference, who could afford to report, did so. It hasn't happened. So I do think there is it's endemic in the I think in the main organised religions that they just lack of transparency. So
okay, Phil,
just the way they've operated.
It's almost 8:10, and I'd like to invite Alec to make a few remarks. So maybe you could wrap up your presentation and then we'll move on.
Okay, well, I think I really only had one more. I do have two more. So this is just a very small example. I mentioned that the under the ACNC Act there are 12 line items for a small charity that's not a BRC to report. This is probably about 15% of what a small religious congregation reporting to its denominational authority, to its synod office or diocesan office would report. And you can see that this is a lot more information than is required under the ACNC Act. So that, yes, where I wanted to end was simply, why does this matter? I'm probably pretty converted here, but you know, the community went to great lengths to develop the ACNC legislation. It was called for many, many years, and I think a lot of people, you know, I think it's worked really well. But yet, 17% are exempt, and I think it won't be unreasonable. I think most people would think it's a pretty reasonable thing to expect transparency when the community is providing such significant support to basic religious charities. So I shall stop the share now. Yeah. Okay.
Terrific. Phil, thank you for that. That's a really sort of deep dive into one part of the philanthropic, the third sector, the not-for-profit sector. And I think it's an area that mostly the general public are not aware of. So you've done a real service in looking at the detail and the facts and bringing and pulling those together into your working paper. What do you intend to do with the research data that you've pulled together into this paper?
Well, my first objective is to make a submission to the minister, who is Minister Andrew Lee, who is the minister who has carriage of the charities regulation. And so my first next thing to do is I've got all the information together, was to make a submission there, and you know, I'm not alone in putting this view that something has to change, but I'm hoping that this research will, you know, provide a useful argument for him to investigate this and hopefully make some changes. That was my first objective, really, in doing this. Yeah.
Okay, terrific. Thank you, Phil. That's really, really helpful. Alex Spencer, could I ask you to unmute? You have, and maybe, there you go. Now we can see you as well. Would you like to maybe just make some comments about what you've just heard from Phil, but also add your own remarks?
Yes, thank you very much. The manifestation or the creation of the BRC category is nothing more than legal entrepreneurship by the churches, and in doing so, it quarantined basic religious charities, those who advance religious purposes only, from the governance criteria of the ACNC Act and also the reporting criteria. And it was a very strategic and a very entrepreneurial exercise that it had achieved, but without, it was, as you sort of alluded to or implied in your opening, it was a very discreet, it was a very subterfuge way of going about it. And I read through every one of the parliamentary speeches, and there was no mention to it other than we had made some adjustments to streamline the conversion of existing charities across to this new Charities Commission. So, but there was no logic, as Justice Kirby said in the Word Investments case, as other academics have said, there is no logic, there is no reason for it, and it was a bad look upon the churches, and particularly the Catholic Church, to be advancing a statutory position to give it secrecy, particularly on the cusp of the largest royal commission into child sex abuse, which is all built around secrecy and privacy and so forth. So to have a federal regulator, basically it resulted in the regulator, the regulated, being the churches, telling the regulator how to be regulated. And it got away with it. And this new subcategory of registration, which, by the way, assumes 10% error rate. So there's 10% of all charities registered with the ACNC are erroneously registered with the Charities Act as basic religious charities, and the upside for them to erroneously register with as BRCs is that they do not have to report their activities or their finances. So they live in a world of secrecy. And as our speaker just said, one of the interesting things is that these religious development community funds, these are supposed to be churches that exist to advance religion, exclusively advance religion, because somehow in our modern society, we all need more religion. Now that is the judicial position, we need more religion. So the result of this registration is that the churches, for example, but not all of them enjoy this privilege of secrecy. For example, established churches like the Anglican Church, the Catholic Church, and so forth, enjoy it because they are not federally regulated. But the Hillsong churches, for example, which is federally regulated because they are registered as companies under the Corporations Act, because they are federally regulated entities, they have to report their finances, even though that they are basic religious charities. But the older established churches do not have to report, and that's where the money is. That's where the real money is, and that's where the real assets are. And there are reports given by archbishops and others that referring to not only millions, but tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in those accounts. And the ABC reporting has referred to this as rivers of gold. It is an extraordinary. So you've got a church that is registered as a bank, but can't behave like a bank, but take monies from the public like a bank, but do not report like a bank, but they are still churches. So it's an extraordinary mix of banking, corporation, and charity and religious law all in one, all bundled up in one, but tucked up in a world of secrecy because of the unique category called basic religious charities. It is an extraordinary entrepreneurial exercise that I've never seen before in corporation law and in any other facet of governance.
Interesting use of the word entrepreneurial, Alec. Margot Dean.
I'm trying to be polite.
Yes, I get that. Margot Dean makes a comment. Are the public aware of this? Why are they not furious? Would you care to comment?
Yeah, because things are done in secret. This is, and when it went through in 2012, the whole thing, for example, the Charities Act in 2012, the ACNC Act in 2013, all these things went through Parliament, and they were all relied on the Elizabethan Act of 1601. And the 1601 Elizabethan Act only referred to religion in the in the introduction of the Act, not in the preface of the Act, but not in the Act itself. And the only reference to religion in the Act, in the 1601 Elizabethan Act, was with regards to municipal restoration of public utilities, bridges and schools and so forth, but not and church buildings, but not religion itself. So and all that's been followed through 200 years later in the Bishop Morris case in 200 years later. And so we rely on very flimsy, very unique, very unusual. It lacks support, it lacks gravitas, it lacks judicial competence and consistency to have this world of secrecy and to even identify religion as a charitable service. And even religion in the discussions within the ACNC second reading speeches all refer to the derivative elements of religion in terms of its good services to the community, but not in terms of religion itself. So it's the derivative benefits that it provides. And because of the derivative benefits, we then hide behind the world of human rights provisions of secrecy and privacy and special provisions. But when I've gone through the human rights provisions, whether it be international statutes or the domestic statutes, there is no provisions for secrecy, and it's all about equality. It's all about good governance. And so I'm yet to define or identify a cogent argument that says we are so special that we deserve secrecy and privacy. And the other thing is, in reference to the ACNC revision that occurred 5 years after the act occurred, no person who put all the 20 charities that put in said, look, we are burdened by the impost of having to report because we're small and we're special and we're different. No one gave empirical evidence as to the burden of having to report. But the 2 million small businesses in Australia that do have to report for their goods and services tax collection every month to the tax office, there's no excuse for them to have to report on giving their taxes to the government, who then pay the churches who benefit from those things, who benefit from those taxes. The counter response to them is, well, they don't have, the mums and dads, small businesses who have to pay the tax, but the churches who receive the benefit of those tax exemptions do not have to report on that. And the only response to the ACNC review was that it's an excessive burden, but no evidence is given for that burden.
Phil, would you like to make a comment on Alex's remarks?
Well, I think it's true. There was no empirical evidence. I'm hoping that the empirical evidence that I've got has rebutted those arguments. I think they have. I think the arguments to show that the small churches have greater capacity than do small charities or not BRCs. I think that's a pretty damning argument and it's based on empirical evidence. So I think the empirical evidence is there now. There was no empirical evidence put. No, it was simply pressure. One good source that that I have spoken to about this said that there was a high court, a threat of a high court challenge to the whole act, really because of the issue of the governance standards. That if church organisations were subject to governance standards, there would be an argument put that would be counter to freedom of religion, and I think perhaps the government of the day was pragmatic and let the BRC category stand with its lack of transparency in order to get the rest of the act through. And as I said earlier, I think the act has done a lot of good. I think this is one small thing that hopefully we can now, or the government can now clean up, because there is no argument for it. There was no empirical evidence, so I'd agree with Alec about that. Yeah.
Can I just bring in, because we're fast running out of time, and I'd just like to get to some of the questions that have been sent in beforehand.
Yeah.
Margot Dean said, "Are the public aware of this and of what this is? And if not, why are they not furious?" Well, I think the facts are that they're not aware of it, and this is why both of you are doing a public service to gather this data and to be able to make it known. But then Astrid Dean asks this question: what is the most effective way you would determine that transparency in religious charities could be improved, and what would be the ripple effects if this occurred. So how can we move this forward and start to challenge the lack of transparency, the lack of accountability? What's the best way of changing this state of affairs from where we are now?
Well, I think it would be a simple, I shouldn't use that word. I think it would be possible, particularly with the financial reporting. I think there might be, I wouldn't be surprised if there was a High Court challenge from religious organisations like the Catholic Bishops' Conference, if the governance standards were to apply. I mean, I can't see the problem there. The governance standards, I think, it does. The commissioner, the charities commissioner, has the power to remove someone from being a board member of a charity if they're not acting in a proper way. I think most people would accept that that is a perfectly legitimate right for a regulator to have, that we do have this, and it goes back to the 400 years ago. Religions are in a privileged position. So if the government was to change or attempt to change the ACNC Act to allow the government's provisions to apply, I think that would possibly end up in court. The reporting requirements I see as a lot less problematic. That's my personal view. What can we do about it? Well, I think if people were to write to their members of parliament and say, look, this is ridiculous. Why is there this secrecy? Why is there lack of transparency? I mean, we're just everywhere we look these days. Transparency, if there's a problem in the world, often there's a lack of transparency that goes along with it. So I think most people would think that all charities should be treated equally. If they're a small charity that is advancing religion, or they're a small parents and friends association of a school, has to report, if they're a charity, which many are, to those 11 line items. So I would think that most people would be appalled if they knew this was happening. And there were a series, David Huddaker, the journalist in Crikey, wrote a few articles last year, which I think garnered quite a lot of interest. And I think he exposed it to a wider audience that this situation obtained. And so I think the more people that know about it, I think people would want to do something. Yeah.
And Alec, you've been on a podcast exposing particularly Hillsong, but other BRCs as well?
One of my main concerns, Meredith, is with the secrecy that comes with BRCs, is that we don't see the upstream flow of funds from the lower, religious, educational, and welfare, and so forth. The percentage of administrative and various other costs that flow up to the unreported BRCs, so flow up to the churches that run the lower charitable services for traditional services. So the religious charities, the BRCs, we don't see the upstream flow of funds to them. And the fact is that 23 of the largest 25 charities in Australia, 23 of them are religious. And the upflow of funds, the upstream flow of funds, we don't get to see that because of the non-reporting, principally of established BRCs. When I say established, as Phil said, those who are established under the pre-federation governance provisions and various other things in unincorporated associations, they don't have to account or account publicly for their funds, but those funds flow up to those BRCs, and that's where the rivers of gold exist. And those funds are substantial, and what's reported, even in the Royal Commission, is about a third of what's happening in reality. And the Alice case in the Royal Commission reflects that.
Right. I am going to start to pull this to a close because we have 2 minutes before 8:30. But I think you can see that we have a couple of warriors on our hands here who are doing the hard work of really finding out what the evidence really says, to support the sort of people that in the Rationalist Society, we've been putting in submissions to governments of both sides for many years, saying it doesn't make sense in this day and age to have advancing religion as an automatic head of charity. And in fact, those religious institutions who do charitable works would be able to be counted under other heads of charity, like the relief of poverty or advancing community welfare. There is really no need for this head of charity called advancing religion. And as we have heard tonight, there are considerable disbenefits from a public sense in continuing to have this category. However, I'm not going to hold my breath that the government is going to remove advancing religion overnight as a head of charity. But the idea of drawing to the decision makers' attention this evidence that the BRCs were brought in behind a veil of ignorance and continue to be to not have to account for themselves is, in this day and age where there are more people concerned about transparency, I think we've got more of a chance of really putting a dent in that public issue. With that, it is 8:30, and I'm always very conscious that people give up their evening time. So I am going to bring this to a close, but in doing so, I'm sure I speak on behalf of everybody to say, Phil, you've done us a great benefit in doing all this hard work and bringing this data together. And we'll stay in touch when you send in your working paper. If you do get a response from Andrew Lee, the Minister for Charities, we'd be very interested to hear about it. And Alec, please stay in touch, because if we can assist by highlighting any of the terrific work that you're doing as well, we'd be more than happy to do that.
Well, thank you, Meredith, and thank you to the Rationalist Association. Just make one comment. I think the issue here is that this is all totally legitimate and legal. There's no scandal with this. There are scandals in particular. Hillsong's a good example, and it ought to be prosecuted. But the issue with the Basic Religious Charity is that it's totally legal and wrong. So thank you for this opportunity to share this the research and
the challenge is one of law reform.
Well. Yes. Oh, definitely. Absolutely.
All right.
Okay.
Well,
thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. As usual, we will upload a recording of this seminar onto our YouTube channel, and we'll let everybody know when that is going up. So if you do need to, if you would like to draw on some of the arguments that have been put tonight, please feel free to do so. And in particular, just drop an email to your local MP pointing out what we have learned tonight. And Phil, I'm sure you'll be happy to, will you be happy to share your slides?
Oh, definitely. And my email is on the first slide. I'm very happy to do that. And I'm very happy to receive any communication if anyone wants to discuss anything that we can discuss I'd be really pleased to do that. So my email's on that first slide, so it'd be terrific. Yes, very happy to do that.
And we'll remind people of that when we send out the note about the uploaded video recording. So with that, I'll say good night to everybody, and thank you so much for your time and attention.